بعدما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me on it. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, I'm here with Professor Scott Ferguson of, let's see, where are you teaching these days, Scott?
I'm at the University of South Florida.
At the University of South Florida, and the author of Declarations of Dependence, which is probably the first book I encountered, which was a critical theory approach to modern monetary theory and some of the political implications of it. I wanted to ask you, why did you decide to engage in what is traditionally seen as an economic framework as a critical theoretical framework?
Well, thanks for having me. That's actually a really good question. And to be honest, I experienced it in a backwards way to the way you framed it. So I have long been interested in the critical theory tradition, which, as most people know, is one of the many iterations, articulations of Marxism. And Marxist critical theory poses a lot of critical questions about history, class politics, culture, aesthetics, and we can kind of get into kind of reviewing what critical theory is all up to. And it poses those questions in particular ways. It has particular habits and particular assumptions that I had fully internalized. Even if I think I probably I kind of felt their tensions and their limits and their blind spots, even as I was inhabiting them. And when I was trying to research, heterodox political economy in, 2010, 2011, 2012, and discovering the post-Keynesian tradition and modern monetary theory and institutional economics, I sort of realized that there were other assumptions and other ways of posing some of these fundamental questions in critical theory in different ways, in ways that could be more capacious. So I wasn't like an MMT person who then thought, oh, we should do some critical theory with this stuff. My position was I was a critical theorist, and what MMT was saying, and often what I was reading in MMT, not as a positivist or literalist discourse, but kind of in its deeper, sometimes half or unconscious implications, I felt that, wow, this can really unsettle and blow open the critical theory tradition in really what for me were exciting ways. But then when I started to try to talk to friends of mine who were variously committed to Marxist critical theory, some of them got excited, some of them got afraid of me, and some of them pushed back and really wouldn't truck with where I was trying to go.
I mean, it's interesting because I think about the history of critical theory, which comes out of Marxism. The Horkheimer-Adorno relationship of critical theory, though, has always this plausible deniability of a break or a continuity with Marxism. And it kind of depends on the scholar or even what time you're reading Horkheimer or Adorno.
Yeah.
So which critical theorists did you find most useful to re-evaluate with this lens you were getting from MMT?
I have to say that I have not focused on one or another.
Okay.
What I would say is that I'm certainly indebted to what's often written big C, big T critical theory, and that's the Frankfurt School. And those are traditionally we think of people like Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. And there are others, and then there are the fellow travelers, people like Walter Benjamin and Siegfried Krakauer. Those thinkers are actually really important in film studies, which is my primary discipline. But that's like big C, big T critical theory. I think if you are a practicing humanities student or scholar, since I don't know, the 60s or 70s, you typically, most people have a kind of big tent approach to critical theory. So the Black radical tradition counts, the feminist and queer theory counts, post-colonial and decolonial theory counts, abolitionism counts, the list goes on and on. So, structuralism and post-structuralism, cultural studies coming out of the Birmingham School in the UK, various kind of critical new media theories. So I guess I was really thinking in broad terms about a lot of the assumptions that all of these schools variously share, and thinking that, wow, to use Marxist language, the form of value, the way that MMT opens up the question of the form of value in this different way, really challenges a lot of the kind of interlocking parts of these critical theory traditions that I still nevertheless feel that I'm a part of and want to, dialogue with and, to my mind, help make better.
So one of the interesting things about modern monetary theory's recent, academic history is it does come out of heterodox economics. There's the chartalist and neo-chartalist element. There's also the, let's say, heterodox Keynesian or the heterodox response to the new Keynesians, depending on how from Minsky forward. And then there's a separate strand, which is like Christine Dasein and that's constitutional studies people who look at kind of the legal history of law and money.
Yeah, and they don't call themselves MMT.
Right.
Yeah. And then inside of there's institutional economics and Veblen. I mean, there's a lot that's kind of packed into what gets called MMT that isn't always acknowledged.
So, where do you situate well, we've already kind of talked about this. You situate yourself in critical theory, but your recent book, Declarations of Dependence, kind of goes through a couple of problematics in different time periods. The one you focus on is shifts in the thinking around money in, let's say, the early modern Catholic Church and European discourse. So like the shift from a kind of Augustinian mode to a Franciscan mode, and the Franciscan particular emphasis on poverty, leading to a kind of negative discourse that you think actually constructs an austerity mode of what would become capitalism, right?
Yeah, will become like an early modern liberal Enlightenment construction of monetary mediation.
How important do you think that is?
I think it's incredibly important, but actually, I'd like to step back a second and maybe spell out what, at least for me, is important about critical theory, and then I've been talking around this, but I want to put more meat on the bone. So, critical theory traditionally starts with a distinction between itself, critical theory, and what gets called traditional theory or conventional theory.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, basically this is a revival of, you know, Marx and the thesis on Feuerbach, right? The philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. The way that Horkheimer will, you know, reanimate this in an essay called, I think it's called Critical and Traditional Theory, is that traditional theory is really a descriptive theory. It's a normative theory. It's a theory that naturalizes the status quo, and is essentially a kind of instrumentalist theory that naturalizes the status quo, including the, you know, the relations of production and class asymmetry, in order to then exploit that system, that model, in order to perpetuate the injustices of that system, right? But to do it in the name of reason and enlightenment or utility or any number of kind of bourgeois, kind of slippery universals that are really excuses. So, right, critical theory is interested in critiquing, right? And that word critique, as critical theorists often point out, is related in its root to the root word for crisis, right? So where traditional theorists see more or less a world that is stable enough, the critical theorist sees crises, sees conflicts, sees tensions, sees antinomies, sees disagreements, paradoxes, etc., etc. And those contradictions, those crises, those paradoxes are a sign that not everything is okay, that injustice prevails, and that the dominant modes of making sense of the world, of social relations, of ecological relations, actually don't hold, and they are covering up and naturalizing systemic injustice. So that's, I think, step one. So critical theory looks for the crises and wants to acknowledge the crises in order to change the world, in order to transform the world. The second thing is that the critical theorists, and this is the just so story that they themselves tell, especially Georg Lukács, who kind of opens the door for a lot of these critical theorists, even if he's not an official member of the Frankfurt School. They're looking at what they see as vulgar materialist tendencies in the Second International, and saying to themselves, well, I mean, first of all, most of them had training in European aesthetics and German aesthetics in particular, and were variously experts at, you know, for Lukács, he was a literature professor, you know, Adorno was a musicologist, you know, Benjamin famously is like a kind of proto-multimedia theorist who never got a job, or never got a scholarly job. And, you know, they, although of course they still kind of recognize what they feel the importance of the base superstructure distinction is, they'll still use that language, but they I think radically volatilize it and get rid of any, they push back on any kind of like unidirectional causality, and they will, you know, they'll insist that essentially aesthetics and culture and politics and everything that's sort of banished in certain supposedly vulgar Marxist discourses, to mere superstructure, mere fluff, mere add-on, mere idealism, is actually constitutive, is actually meaningful, but not self-identically, right? Not necessarily on its own terms, right? But is part of the historical process and is part of conflict, is part of the crisis, and also is complicated enough that there are sort of, for these various theorists, there are impulses to affirm, various impulses to affirm in aesthetics and culture. So they really dedicate themselves to thinking about aesthetics and culture with this in mind. So, I'm on board for most of that stuff. That was my training. I think, part of critical theory, another part of critical theory that's very important to me is expressed by Adorno really well, that critical theory aims to lend a voice to suffering, and not just lend a voice to suffering that has been repressed, but also to, in their kind of quasi-messianic Judaic language, to redeem it, right? To honor it, and to redeem it by not only letting it resonate, but then changing the world to make things better, right? To make things whole again, or for the first time. And then, so with these kind of impulses and analyses in mind, critical theorists, especially the big C, big T ones, and those who are most faithful to that tradition, I'm thinking about people like Frederick Jameson and maybe David Harvey, T.J. Clark, across humanities disciplines in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they too are going to be thinking a whole lot about, right, the value form, the form of value. And, another way of putting this is money as mediator, and money specifically as an abstract mediator, an abstract organizer of social relations, of relations of production, and including aesthetics and aesthetic production and cultural forms. And I would say that most critical theorists, although they don't always put it this way, I think it's fair and persuasive to claim that critical theory in this mainline tradition has been preoccupied with the problem of money as a broader problem of abstraction, which is also a problem of sensuous belonging and questions of justice and history. So with this in mind, and me, thinking this, inhabiting this, teaching this for years and years, when I got to modern monetary theory, I was not necessarily immediately taken by, positivist or literalist claims like the sovereign currency issue can't, to me, I was reading sort of through and around those articulations, and I was seeing an understanding of money qua abstraction that I thought, wait a minute, this is saying that money qua abstraction and abstraction are like truly contestable and truly reshapeable. Not that it's a Pollyanna, yay, we can fix it without conflict, but that there is, and I kind of started to reckon with the fact that the Marxist tradition and the critical theory Marxist tradition really begins from a place of, begins from an assumption that money is abstract value, it's abstract exchange value, and that expresses a fundamental underlying alienation. And once I started to move that peg out of the system and start slotting in, kind of an openness to MMT and what a non-alienating, like a non-necessarily alienating, a non-lapsarian theory of money could do, everything started to kind of shift for me in a big and exciting way.
So we were talking before we started recording about your views on abstraction, and how you wanted to kind of move abstraction away from both the analytic tendency to see abstraction as the removal of qualia or the removal of some, sensuous something other than, abstraction is usually seen as reducing something to its form or its quanta, depending. And then in the kind of continental Marxist perspective, abstraction is seen as the fetish character that hides alienation and hides different kinds of arguably usually conflicting relationships.
Exactly. And then so in that way, to use Adorno's language, it's the dialectic of enlightenment. It's identity thinking as such. It's reason as identity thinking, which for Adorno and Horkheimer, right, that identity can't hold, right? It can try to destroy, it can try to order, it can try to put everything in a box, but the dialectical character of reality or of history, or of epistemology, or all of it, is self-undermining. And I don't agree with that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, you fundamentally reject that, right?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, and as a dirty Marxist, I am like, okay, like, that's my initial response is always like, okay, so what do we mean by abstraction here then?
Yeah, so I admittedly have a really idiosyncratic, arguably just novel understanding of abstraction that is, I will admit, is just not, I mean, it's still related to the word abstraction. I stand by the transvaluation and the redefinition, but like, rather than using another word, for example, but I think what I'm up to with theorizing abstraction is really unsettling in relationship to the way we usually think about it. So we've discussed a variety of ways: reduction, subtraction, quantification, flattening identities, all of this. And I guess, so what I offer is that the dominant modern Western metaphysics tends to be predicated, there's different ways I put this, it tends to be predicated on an original individuality. All there are individuals, and those individuals could be persons, they could be families, they could be firms, they could be, I don't know, a church, they could be a relationship, but all there are primary particulars or primary individuals, and then relations, obligations, mediations, institutions, and certainly money are always thought to be kind of super added. They're like, they're imposed, or they're a product of convergence, right? Willful convergence, either willful imposition or willful convergence.
Okay.
And so if you start from a primary individuality, then and any relationality or mediation or abstraction, which I'll just define as mediation at a distance, or I have different ways of putting it. Remote coordination is going to read as a potential threat and a potential fall. And what I see is, whether it's in Marx and Marxism and critical theory, or in the liberal tradition, or in fascist traditions, this is usually taken for granted. It's the fundamental problem. How do you make sense of the world and argue for and struggle for the right kind of society or the right kind of political order, given the originary individualism of everything? And yeah, so I reject this, and I want to say, no, institutions, organizations, obligations, credits, and debts, none of it is like necessary in their particular historical instantiations, right? Like nothing is necessary about any order. But what I would say is what is necessary is mediation as such. It's not super added to individuals. It's always primary, I would say. And you only get individuation as a function of these kind of heterogeneous nested scales. And so what I would say is it's important to be critically theorizing at these nested scales without being afraid that you're going to be flattening or homogenizing or taking away from individuality. Because I would say that this is a kind of an illusion of these modern Western metaphysics. I would say that this is a kind of a fantasy of hemorrhaging or disintegration when we get wrapped up in the ways that, in Marxist language, the value form homogenizes, makes exchangeable, as abstract labor time, socially necessary labor time. And then we have this kind of drama of abstract socially necessary labor time being evacuated from the worker through the wage form. And I'm not pro wage form. I'm not pro 19th century industrial capitalism any more than I'm pro contemporary shit show fascist neoliberalism. But what I would argue is that the premises from which we critique these systems and we try to imagine and build and fight for new ones should not be proceeding from this originary individuality. And this is actually what brings us to the Franciscans.
Okay. Yeah. So one thing I could say is, as a student at one point in my life of ancient philosophy, the individual ethnos, polis, class stuff in that is very different than anything we see in modern thought. But in an almost Nietzschean sense, to throw out a term, I do sort of see the focus on the individual start to come up in those dialectical dialogues of Socrates, right? And that's what's focused on and picked up, particularly, I think, in the time period you're talking about. So there's a lot of humanists, and by here I don't mean like the ideological humanists. I mean the people in the humanities who would talk about like the ideological individuation of, say, late medieval Christianity, changing the nature of literature in Dante, where we're talking about individuals, than in say the Iliad and the Odyssey, where we're dealing with typologies of people, really, except for the heroes. So I can kind of see what you're talking about, but I was very interested in the specific shift that you saw in the framing of poverty and monastic poverty from the Augustinian, Benedictine, whatever, to the Franciscan. Not because I don't know if I agree with it, but there are some things I have noticed in reading other, because I am probably one of those positivistic people that you're talking about, as a very literal reading of history. But when I was reading in the origins of capitalism, and I was, getting all that Max Weber stuff we're taught out of my head, I did notice that the first things that met the definition of capital that you would call like proto-capital and Marxism, in quotation marks, is actually in certain monastic relationships in like the 11th and 12th century. And Brundel, the French theoretician of the longue durée, talks about this. And so that just kind of corresponded with this like ideological story that you told in your Declarations of Independence. So let's go into that. What did the Franciscans accidentally do, and how did they do it?
Oh boy. Okay. So an important contrast for me is, well, let me just say this, right? We trace history at least for me, like I'm not digging for gold when I do history. I'm enough of a Nietzschean, to use the term again, to realize that, history is for life, right? And it's like, well, what can you do with history, right? So to a certain extent, history is always myth making. And I'll own that, right? Which isn't to say that like I don't care about evidence. Of course I care about evidence. I'm not just making shit up. But right. So I don't claim to have the story or like this is where capitalism started. But I think what I've traced and uncovered is it's actually just a different frame and a different analysis of a story that kind of gets told all the time in a variety of places about where Western modernity came from. And I'm not the first person to tell the story. I'm just the first person to tell it in this particular way. So first of all, so to come back to the main contrast that I was interested in the book, which is the contrast between what Thomas Aquinas is up to and versus what the Franciscans are up to. And they're sort of, the Thomists and the Franciscans are, St. Thomas is a Dominican. And right, he belongs to the Dominican order, and St. Francis, founds the Franciscan order. And they both are ascetic traditions that practice poverty, right? So just to be clear, even though I would say, a kind of historical interest in affirming certain kinds of impulses in those Thomists, not modern Thomists. I can't truck with modern Thomists, but those Thomists, it's not because they rejected the life of poverty. They too practiced this. They were less radical than the Franciscans. The Franciscans, St. Francis's origins come from a repudiation of his paternal wealth. He was like arguably like the son of like a successful merchant, and he repudiated his wealth and not only started this order based on radical poverty, but also forbid his followers from touching money. And then there's all these stories that go along with Francis about throwing money into like donkey dung, and like money is the most disgusting thing ever, and how can you, right? And this is a very particular reading of money as just private, acquisitive, all about private property and personal power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what actually interests me more than that is not even, okay, I'll say Thomas Aquinas has interesting things to say about, just prices, and things like that. And there's space in his writing for, it's actually like really helpful for right now, right? Because I think Thomas Aquinas would be like, yeah, we should be, well, he wouldn't say fighting or struggling, but we can translate that, right? We should be fighting and struggling to make these, multinational corporations that are price gouging not fucking do that anymore, right? So, like, yes, there's a money story, but for me, what I'm most interested in is kind of the underlying theology and metaphysics that each one is kind of picking, each one is propagating. And money is only like part of that story. Even if it's conspicuous, especially with the Franciscans. So it's the Franciscans who are the ones who start insisting that being only comes in individuated forms. And this is radically against what Thomas Aquinas was propagating, which was basically he saw the Christian God as essentially this kind of overarching, mediating whole that there was no escape, right? You were one was interdependently part of this whole, right? And of course, one can critique Thomas Aquinas and critique the medieval Catholic Church. I'm not an apologist for any of it, but I'm interested in, just as an origin story, the contrast between, well, one guy who's like, yeah, like abstract mediation matters, and then the other folks who are like, no, that's super added, that's essentially bullshit. All there are individuals. They argued that God was a separate individual, just a super all-powerful individual, not just like the mediating relationships that we all heterogeneously share. And so their whole theology, their whole social practice, even though they're known as kind of like the first proto-Marxists and social justice warriors and first like ecologists, what I worry about with the Franciscans is that they introduce an understanding of the world that says only individuals are real, and individuals are primary, and that anything above that is essentially, a secondary fall or some kind of alienation, and that's a big problem for me.
Okay. So this is where your lapsarian focus kind of comes in here.
Yeah, and for them it was straight up lapsarian. It was about a reading of Eden. It was about a reading of Eden that said, you know, in Eden things were okay, and now we're fallen, and now we're all just individuals that are cut off from everybody else. So that's why we have to group together to form solidarity and to, minister to the poor. And, I'm not, we can minister to the poor, that's fine. But I'd rather struggle to reimagine and reorganize the system that mediates the whole, such that we don't have poor people in the first place.
Mm. So another focus of your book that I found interesting, and whenever we say the H name Heidegger, people get in hackles.
Yes,
rightly in some ways.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
But as you were explaining your issues with abstraction, I actually was thinking about Heidegger's the long, torturous event of reading Being in Time when I was in graduate school. But Heidegger's critique of rationality, as opposed to, say, the Weberian or the Frankfurt School critique of instrumental rationality, Heidegger has a more all-encompassing critique of reason, of almost of reason as such, right?
Although I would say Adorno and Horkheimer do too, but
different.
And they hate him. Yeah, they hate Heidegger. Yeah.
Well, it is. You have to really understand the subtleties of the critique of instrumental reason and its manifestation of dialectic of enlightenment to really get how different they are than Heidegger, because superficially they look very close. But to get more into that detail, you used Heidegger in your book, and
a little bit.
Can you talk about what about Heidegger's issues with, say, Enlightenment rationality and individuality did you find helpful to your project? So
I do not find his critique of rationality, or even his, I think he's a Franciscan, just like, he wrote a dissertation about Duns Scotus, who's a Franciscan. I don't see him getting out of the trap of that. Mm-hmm. And I do think that he shares a very common, I think, reductive view of rationality, even if, I'm not like, I have no interest in defending, Enlightenment rationality. So what animates what has been meaningful to me about Heidegger, I think, is, and the reason why I dared to cite Heidegger in my book is because I have long been wrestling with trying to articulate a theory of interdependence that I call care, that Heidegger at least minimally helps me get some leverage with. So primarily, so for Heidegger, care, Sorge, is this primary problem. It's this primary question, and it's the question of being, the question of the meaning of being for Dasein, right, for the human being, at least in his early work. So it's not positivist. It's an open question, and it's a kind of burden and charge. It's not something you can escape. It's not something you can decide to take on or not. You can kind of try to repress it or run from it, but one's interdependence and one's sense of being burdened by big problems of care is a crucial non-positivist foundation for Heidegger. Now, what I would say is that he still frames this as the existential self. And I also don't think that later Heidegger, that sort of is proto-post-structuralist, that's sort of decentering the self, gets out of this problem either. So what was meaningful for me, and I don't think I'll ever write, I don't see myself coming back to this again and again in my writing, but I think most meaningful for me is thinking as baseline constitutive of human being, of eco-social being and relationality as a fundamental interdependence, a remote interdependence that's not just about me and who I choose to relate to, or me and who imposes their will on me, but everything and all institutions and the frigging cosmos. And so I think Heidegger kind of opens up that question. He just opens it up in a kind of a bad way. I think you're laughing probably at comments, but I'm going to ignore it.
We're ignoring that.
Okay. I'm not reading them. So for me, this kind of fundamental problem of dependence is what I argue, that's where I argue any critique, any politics, any socialist project, any aesthetic project should be starting.
Okay. So let's go into the definition. So you found this notion of care from Heidegger that you think that he tries to de-individuate a little bit, or at least decenter the self. Particularly, this is picked up in the works of Derrida. I think, I'm as we're talking, Scott, I gotta admit, I'm going back to 15 years ago, English grad school brain. So I'm going, I haven't talked about Derrida in any serious way in probably a decade.
I'm happy to define anything we say, we always start at the basic premises.
So let's take a little bit here. So first of all, positivism is a very serious charge in German philosophy in the early 20th century, unless you are a logical positivist.
Yes.
Everybody hates them. Lenin doesn't like them. Adorno doesn't like them. Heidegger doesn't like them. Dilthey doesn't like them. But what is it? So let's define positivism and then get into non-positivist.
Okay. I think I didn't come prepared to define positivism, but I guess we can try. So I think that there's a positivism in a way holds a faith in the fidelity of direct description of the world, and does so for So a direct description of the world that then can be logically understood. And then the world can be, built, transformed to meet whatever rational ends are necessary, right? So, this in part was a socialist project, as we know, right? The in Vienna, right? The logical positivists were very much part of Red Vienna and
Right.
And things to be proud of, right?
Austro-Marxism basically split into two sub-theoretical categories after the political wing of Austro-Marxism all get killed by Nazis, and that's just a fact. You basically have the logical positivists on one time, and their mirror, dark or light, depending on your opinion, anti-positivist Frankfurt School. At the same time, and the other thing is like positivism, goes back to like Auguste Comte and Durkheim was the conservative version, I guess. So
So I'm not a positivist. I don't believe that denotative descriptions of the world are self-evident, and that can be kind of just rationally and logically leveraged without conflict or detour or enigma or mystery. So
I mean, what's at stake here is basically for the listeners is, can I make valid generalizations based off of basically empirical description without any conflict, and just state it as an unquestioned, uncritical truth. And in the logical form, the logical positivists, they try to back that up a little bit more with like, if it is logically valid and it is empirically true, then we can say that it is true, unquestionably.
And I'm much more of a Frankfurt schooler. Validity claims are not my issue. My issue is injustice and conflict and suffering and pleasure and community.
So this brings us to your more positive political project or critical project. You work primarily in film studies, right?
I mean, that's my training. I teach in it, but I mean, I'm also just, I'm very promiscuous. But that's my home base. Yes. Yeah.
Well, humanist again. Humanitarian is the wrong word. So I mean, you probably are a dirty humanitarian, but that's actually a different claim. In which ways, you've done a lot. I've heard a lot of your lectures on, say, the neoliberal blockbuster, and what that says are how at least the popular conception is constituting what is community, what is money, etc.
What is mediation? What's real? What matters?
Let's go into that a little bit, because I think that will probably seem where this stuff seems less obscure than when we're talking about Franciscans in the 14th and 15th and 16th century.
Okay.
So not really the 14th and 15th century, but if I remember, I went to Catholic school for a little while, and I should be better at this.
Well, I mean, they stick around and they fracture, and there's radical ones, and then and less radical
being
ones.
proto-Protestants at some point.
Yeah. I mean, there would have been no Reformed Christianity. There would have been no Luther and no Calvin if it hadn't been for Francis and Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. I mean, Luther was he had some critiques, but essentially he was like an Ockhamist.
So, to get more into the applications of this for popular culture now, what do you see that what did you mean by the neoliberal blockbuster? That's a phrase that's going to seem less out of the blue to normal leftist listeners, but probably still needs definition.
Okay, so I will define it, but then I'm going to go back
that's fine,
and draw a through line from like Florentine Renaissance to the neoliberal blockbuster. So the neoliberal blockbuster, as I define it, so the term blockbuster actually comes from World War II American military like PR campaign, like war bonds drive, and it was like a bomb called the blockbuster, and it was like on display. Buy a war bond to pay for this big bomb that's going to go blow up Hitler, and then that term just got picked up, and it was used to like describe hit plays and stuff like that. And then it got used to talk about big budget spectaculars from classical Hollywood in like the 50s and 60s. And if you know anything about classical Hollywood post World War II, is that this is like this is an era of decline, and the studio system is hemorrhaging money. They have to white flight and suburbanization means that, you know, all the theaters are in the urban core. They're being evacuated, and people are playing miniature golf and watching TV instead of going into the city to see movies. And they start, you know, this is the age of like 3D and all CinemaScope and bells and all kinds of bells and whistles and, you know, stuff like that. And they will start changing their business model, and they'll start making more and more of these like big budget spectaculars. And then one will hit, like Sound of Music, and then they go, the studio system goes nuts, and then they make a bunch more, and then they flop. So this model is like this failed model of these big budget blockbuster spectaculars until the late 70s. And it's in the late 70s. Okay, well, I'll just keep telling. I'll keep telling the history. So essentially, the Hollywood system, its core industrial kind of Fordist in-house business model, contract labor, starts to unravel by the late 60s, both as like a mode of production and its relations of production, but also as a kind of ideological formation and as a set of aesthetic practices. So a lot of these studios are struggling. Conglomerates and eventually multinational ones start gobbling up the studios. There's a big shakeup. They're like, you know what? Let's hire people to make movies not inside this old stodgy system. So they start hiring people from film school, and they start hiring people from the television industry who are like, I mean, they're all mostly boys, and they're all white men who have something to say and are going to disrupt the industry. This is when the era that we often call the Hollywood Renaissance. It's like Arthur Penn and Sam Peckinpah and Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola, Brian De Palma, people like that. And so they make, what are arguably some, if still problematic, like some pretty great cinema. And they're doing it in more independent ways. They're really breaking all the old Hollywood rules. And it's for all of its problems, it's a pretty good decade of Hollywood cinema. And then in the 1970s, what essentially happens is that kind of disruptive experimental sensibility gets rerouted into a new dominant, huge, money-making, big, risky investment industrial model and aesthetic model. And that's what I call the neoliberal blockbuster, essentially. And this is started by Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. You can film scholars will say that the blockbuster that we come to know in the late 1970s really, as a business model, arises through films that might be counted in this like kind of Hollywood Renaissance mode. So like the Godfather would count, The Exorcist would count. But what I'm interested in more specifically is the Lucas Spielberg blockbuster, because it has a very distinct set of aesthetic commitments that also lock in this new industrial model. And the new industrial model is, effects driven, large budget productions that are intensely risky, that increasingly rely on Wall Street investment, and then aesthetically they are action adventure films that, in my analysis, are absolutely obsessed with immediate material immersive physics.
Okay.
So that's a really long-winded answer to your question. What is the neoliberal blockbuster? So we live with it today. That's what the MCU, the legacy of the MCU is born with Jaws, Close Encounters of Jaws is 75, Close Encounters of the Third Kind is 77, and Star Wars is 77 as well, A New Hope.
Right. It is interesting. I used to do an aesthetics podcast around literature and film, and you can literally look at the change in the highest grossing movies in America in substance in the mid to late 70s. Like, it just fundamentally shifts. Like,
yeah.
So what does that have to do with economics, Scott?
Yeah. Okay. So in my book, I'm interested in, what kinds of cultural aesthetic forms arise as this kind of commitment to individuality as primary, which often means matter as primary, materialized individuality, although it doesn't always, but it often does. And I've gone back to the kind of classic story of the Florentine Renaissance and Renaissance perspective, which, prominent Marxists, especially in film studies, prominent Marxists have read as, premonitions of the rise of the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois subject, because the Renaissance point of view, with its single or multiple vanishing points, situates an individual spectator before an image that is supposed to be a kind of window onto the world, and uses supposedly abstract geometry to deliver this world as property to the viewing subject. So that's like the classic Marxist critical theory aesthetic analysis of what Renaissance perspectival painting does. My reading is that it's actually not abstract at all, that if you compare it to Byzantine forms and Gothic forms that form was pushing back against, literally inside the same churches and the same kinds of buildings. What I would say is that what Renaissance perspective does is it says, no more with the abstraction. What we want is embodied, concrete materiality in which, and this is some of the writings of the period from Alberti, he'll literally write that these good paintings permit motion to only occur through material displacement. So it's only individuals, objects, persons, actions that can only be materially displaced through space, evacuating space over here and moving into space over here, even though they were still. It becomes a more dynamic practice once you get into Baroque painting, and we could tell that whole story. But my argument is that this is a kind of immersive materialist reification that wants to wish away the abstractness of inscription. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, actually it does. And the way it makes sense to me is the fact that Renaissance art is supposed to be perspective neutral, in a lot of ways. I mean, no, it isn't actually. I mean, but it's supposed to, it does
universal. Yeah, a universal individual perspective.
Right, universal individual perspective, and you're supposed to be seeing something as if it was like it was there, even though a lot of that's tricks. But that's another. Yeah, that's another point. As opposed to, say, Byzantine art, which is very specifically about an abstracted human form of which your relationship to it has a forced perspective, which why the weird heads and all this stuff, because it isn't about the individual. There is a relationship, or a hierarchical relationship, admittedly, but there's a relationship expressed in the very perspective of the painting.
And it's meant to be,
or whatever.
Yeah, and it's meant to be, a sign of ritual gathering that happens to take the form of, let's say, a giant Mary with a bunch of tiny ass saints like in her cloak, right?
Exactly.
But it's much more like an abstract aesthetic sign system that convenes social belonging than it is a material individual first, and then you can have relations after that. So I agree that there is a homogenizing mathematics that is the grid, the architecture, the pictorial architecture that is univocal, that houses, that makes possible Renaissance perspective. But I think what I'm saying that's new and different is that it's actually a kind of immersive, immediate, material fetishism that's anxious about abstraction. And you can read the paintings in ways that draw out the symptoms of that anxiety crisis, right? And then you can read the Italian humanists who were poets and rhetoricians at the time, who, these arts are feeding off of one another, who themselves are, making fun of both the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And they're like, all this abstract bullshit with all your stupid terms, right? I mean, they were the first ones to make scholasticism into an epithet, right? Like a dirty word, right? So, people like Erasmus or Lorenzo Valla are can't handle abstraction because reality is immediate and embodied and active. So in my book, I'm kind of picking up on that. And then, I'm a scholar of the blockbuster. So I do this kind of, it's almost like a bookend story where something is happening in a kind of late medieval, early modernity in theology, in metaphysics, in visual aesthetics, that I find problematic and symptomatic, and as a kind of repression of abstract mediation, which again, I want to affirm as a problem of care, a problem of interdependence, that I see coming back with a vengeance in the neoliberal period, right? I mean, this is the Chicago boys go to Chile, the New York fucking fake debt crisis in 75. And then, Carter comes to power and starts deregulating, and we get the Atari Democrats by the late 70s. So, right, this is the moment when what we know as neoliberalism is happening. And so I think originally, when I first started thinking about this in like 2011 or so, I was like, God, like these are of a piece. Like these, Star Wars and Close Encounters come into being as a mode in this neoliberal moment, and they take off. Like this mode sticks, right? So does neoliberalism. So as a political economy. So for me, there was this kind of enigma of like, what's the relationship? And like moving beyond just like, high risk investment, but, nervous investors who want to only invest in pre-sold content, right? So that we end up with, franchises and endless repetition of the, and iterations of the same thing, horizontal integration, merchandising. I mean, all that is easily readable as neoliberal. What I was interested in was the way that this cinema breaks with the history of Hollywood cinema intensely to create a deeply immersive, like rattle your butt immersive audio-visual experience, which makes, or at least tries to make, direct material leveraging or impacts or slipping and sliding the very causal conditions of all of reality, essentially. And my point is not that, so then every, as a global Hollywood commodity, everyone just, believes this like at a conscious level as an ideology. For me, it's a phenomenology. It's a logic of sense that even if we know that, Iron Man, it doesn't exist, or, this is a galaxy far, long time ago, far, far away, we have a dominant cinema with the oncoming of the neoliberal political economic order, which is obsessed with these kind of immediate forces and flows. And, I see resonances with, both pro and anti talk of like globalization and multinational capital flows, and both on the affirmative side, like, Thomas Friedman, the world is flat, but also on, to me, like some of the worst examples are like David Harvey, who wants to think about money qua capital as a water cycle. So it's all of this finite material pushing and pulling and forcing and grinding that I find to be, repressing of abstract mediation, the abstract mediation of cinema, the abstract mediation of media. And then by extension, I think that it unfortunately informs how we think about mediation in general, which would include money. And thinking of mediation as a hydraulics, or even feeling it, not just thinking it, but feeling it, such that, when Obama says we're out of money, it's like, well, you're an asshole, but you're probably right.
I want to give you credit for not blaming Reagan for neoliberalism.
I mean, he's a bastard.
No, yeah,
no, it's not like
undoubtedly
he kicked it off. Yeah.
It's just a common left myth, which is a funny thing to pick out of that long tirade.
Yeah.
I do want to ask you. I am actually very interested because I've thought a lot about this, and my original logic for the neoliberal blockbuster's popularity, and I wouldn't have called it the neoliberal blockbuster. I would probably call it the modern stupid movie. But to be, because I'm not a snob about many things, but on film I am. And I was thinking about that as I was listening to you today, and also some of your available lectures over at Money on the Left, about how my story of that and your story of that are actually somewhat similar.
Ooh,
and I'll tell you my story, but you're going to find me to be a dirty reductionist, positivistic Marxist.
That's fine. Go ahead. Let's do it. As long as we're reflexive about it, it's fine.
So I was thinking about the way that to recoup the money that particularly after the studio system started to die, and you had this and which was a very Fordist style actually production line, which I think people often miss. It produced a very certain kind of product. It was fairly consistent, but felt kind of tired. They went through this auteur period. The auteur period was not so much, I mean, it was very individual, but it was a time of like radical experimentation in a lot of ways, in popular art. But they lost a shit ton of money on a lot of it. Like, I mean, everybody always blames Heaven's Gate, the Michael Cimino movie that basically like lost so much money that United Artists went out of business. And
they were throwing everything. I mean, everything at it. Like, you know, this is the era of blaxploitation, kung fu, right? Those disaster cycle movies with all the, like the old stars and the young ones, and trying to like get everybody out to the movie theater. Like, you must think somebody's sexy here.
Yeah, it is interesting. As a side note, I was watching Valley of the Dolls from the late 60s and noticing some of that stuff, and noticing even though it's a camp movie, and it was like a proto blockbuster kind of that was critically hated. It also is in about 5 different genres and 3 different cinema modes. And so I was thinking about that, and my narrative for that is in some ways similar to yours, in that usually the relationships between people in a deep way require context. And the broader you need to sell a movie, the thinner the context needs to be. Now, this is an obvious argument. Like, this is what we always talk about. Like, the stakes of modern movies now, like particularly by the aught teens, feel like everything and nothing. Like, there's almost no particularity to the stakes because there's no social context for the particularity. Ironically, the complete individual is weirdly contextless, right? It's the hyper individuated movie hero can't have a context because also everybody has to see themselves in them and not any specific kind of relationship. And that broadens your market more and more. It also makes your movie more and more boring, in my personal opinion. And then the only thing you can really fill in with that is this very physical, spectacular stuff. What I'm thinking about here is my narrative, again, being the dirty positivist version of this, would still kind of rhymes with yours, in that you're talking about how all the mediation, the abstraction, is removed. And I would say, yeah,
or
because
it's hidden. I mean, they use abstraction because media is abstract, but they try to hide it.
Right.
Yeah.
And because that mediation, if it's explicit, it would require context of real people having a real community in an abstract way.
That's interesting.
So, I mean, it was interesting because I listened to some of your lectures and I was like, yeah, I actually see what you're talking about from a completely different perspective.
Yeah.
And I think about this because this is one of the few times where I'm going to go, this could easily be an and in both scenario, where there is a way in which kind of, I always hate when I have to resort to unconscious or libidinal forces because that's a cheat, but kind of unconscious or libidinal forces are manifesting in the way people are responding to cinema that reflects certain kinds of social relations and lack thereof. Now, the Marxist inclination, which I have, is to always see hidden conflict everywhere. That's what we do. We everything's a secret fight.
Welcome to the secret fight. That's so funny. Yeah.
I think post-structuralism inherits that and like doubles down on it even more than we do, because it becomes, no, everything's a secret fight about biopower. So everything's a secret fight at the primal level at all times. And
right, that's the Foucault version.
Yes, the Foucault version, where the Marxists are like, that's a little much, man. But you see something else there.
I see something else. I mean, I'm not allergic to reading various kinds of conflicts, class or otherwise, in popular forms. I'm not saying it's not there. Yeah, I see something else there. So not only do I think that these forms repress abstraction and that's bad for us, but I also see it sort of answering the particular regime of neoliberal carelessness or fecklessness, which, I think probably most of the people listening to me right now, they would say, they would want to call it class power. They would want to call it a kind of willful evil, right? And I guess I would say, sure. And there's also a fecklessness. There's also a collective kind of abandonment. Not that there was non-abandonment before neoliberalism. It just took a different shape. And what I would say is the way I read the constant kind of massage, the rumbling massage of the immersive blockbuster is a way of kind of making our sensorium feel like no matter how shitty things get, you can always count on this kind of material basis, this material ground, or this material force like gravity or like inertia, or it takes any number of forms. So it's like the way I read the kind of paradox of what I call the hyper-Newtonian blockbuster, like hyperbolic Newtonianism. So not a strict Newtonianism, like they play with it all the time, like, they break the rules of physics, and yet they're obsessed with physics, even as they're being a little more exaggerated about them. That they're actually functioning as this kind of this deep material cradle of the senses that says they're there, it's going to be okay, especially when shit is falling apart. You'll know that gravity is always here. You can always count on it. Iron Man can lose power at the when he's flying higher than he should, and he might die when he's plummeting to the earth. But the fact that we can count on gravity to pull him down, that we feel the base effects on our body as that's happening, that we see his suit starting to burn up in the atmosphere, and we feel it, that all of those kind of immediate physical reminders of this immersive there-ness is a kind of symptomatic. I don't like the word compensation, really, because I actually think it's like it's deeply meaningful to people. It's like, to me, it's deeply part of the pleasures of the blockbuster, but that doesn't mean it's not symptomatic. And so what I would say is, like, it's assuaging. It's a form of like toxic caretaking that's like, here, abstraction isn't really an issue, and the forces of neoliberalism are just going to do what they're going to do, but at least you can count on them and count on material reality to behave in the way that you're used to.
And so you would read this focus on the material a little differently than I did, where I'm saying, like, okay, well, we focus on material because we can't have the contextual.
Well, I would put contextual on the side of abstraction, right?
Okay.
So to me, abstraction is about relationality, mediation, coordination, like writ large, at a distance, in its heterogeneity, and you need context for that. You need language. You need all kinds of abstract forms to do so. So I think we do kind of converge there. Okay.
So you would say basically that then, yeah, because the reason why we're having a trip up, and I see it, and this goes back to what you did all the way back an hour ago, is my natural inclination when someone says abstraction is to either go Hegel or go analytic philosophy and say, oh, you either mean the formal or you mean that which has become a fetish.
Right.
Or that
Neither.
which has yeah, and you don't mean that. So
and I'm not an idealist either, right?
No,
like,
no,
I'm not,
I haven't accused you of that.
No, I know. I'm just.
I actually find the accusation of idealism harder and harder to place on people, because I realize that, like, even amongst Marxists, it's one of those phrases that you could just be like, and you're an idealist, and you're like, well, what do you mean by that exactly? Like, do you mean that I'm from the German Hegelian, Kant Fichte school of thought? Do you mean that I place ideas first? Do you mean that I don't have a materialist or scientific understanding, et cetera, and then define all those terms? And nobody ever does. So it's kind of it's not an accusation I throw around that much anymore.
Well, we get it. The money on the left crew will get it for sure.
Well, of course you will. What I find interesting in this construction, I do find interesting how much parallel you see between these economic forms and these aesthetic forms, but unlike, say, a one-to-one relationship or even some of the more complicated Marxist aesthetics, you seem to be implying that the reason why these are successful is that they're comforting in a way in these kinds of conditions, right? Thus also reinforce the conditions in the way they comfort you. And so it is a kind of like, it is a kind of unreal. I mean, I'm trying not to go Umberto Eco on you and start talking about hyperreality, but there is a way, though, in which the focus on like Baudrillard or even Eco, and now I'm going to go lapse full back into my own Lapsarian fall from grad school brain, is actually kind of the opposite of what you're saying, because they're always focusing on the unreality of these like early neoliberal cultural forms.
Right.
And what you're talking about is like, no, I mean, they're really obsessed with like actual physics and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that was a huge, when I said earlier that I found that a non-Lapsarian view of abstraction, which I read in, MMT's relatively, like rationalist, like counter-rational, economics. When I said it really unsettled a lot of the questions and like the way of posing certain questions and the assumptions behind it. This was part of it. I mean, so one assumption in the original critical theory project is that Western modernity was getting more and more abstract, and that was bad. And maybe it was dialectically interesting, and we can talk about the negative dialectics or the explosive Benjaminian dialectics that make abstraction a kind of what sometimes I think this is Krakauer called the go for broke gamble of history. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, it's this kind of accelerationist story of more and more abstraction. And then the postmodern moment with people like Jameson come along and they say it's gotten even more abstract, and the kind of dialectical tensions and the class struggle and all the sort of antinomies of modernity that kind of dialectically held this whole thing in check and suggested a kind of dialectical counter pressure have been thoroughly subsumed by capital, and aesthetics, which used to have a kind of dialectical counter resistance, blah, 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 it has been subsumed by capital. So you can't trust that anymore. And now capital is invested in simulating its own simulations to, this endless regress, and there's no critical purchase. And then, famously, Fred Jameson gives us this kind of how I read this is almost like a blockbuster moment in his famous postmodernism book. He's like walking around the Bonaventure Hotel, this postmodern architecture in downtown LA, and he can't get his bearings. It's like this immediate physical, I'm dizzy in this space. You can like feel the camera like over the shoulder and whipping around him in like a Michael Bay shot, right? And like everything's dizzy. He's physically immersed, but it's all kind of overwhelming and seems hyper real. And yeah, to me, I say, no. If you start with a different set of premises, you can see that actually the blockbusters and those postmodern Marxists are both kind of obsessed with physics in their own way and hydraulic models of metaphysics and money and value and labor time. And they're really not, as I see it, not taking abstraction seriously, and they're terrified of abstraction. And so when you start from those premises, you see that, you just end up with different conclusions. So I started studying this stuff in the 90s, and this was like prime time for that kind of Baudrillardian kind of hysteria about postmodern simulacra. Nothing's real anymore. And I mean, it's sexy, it's cool, it's doomerist, but ultimately I think it's a fucking dead end. It's antisocial, and it's certainly not going to it's no basis for abolition or a Green New Deal.
All right. So one of the things that I guess you are saying is the aesthetics reflect a lack of mediation, which itself is a way of hiding mediation, hiding what abstraction, and for you, abstraction refers to kind of all kinds of mediating processes in language and culture, etc. That particularly, Marx, and now every argument I've ever had about an MMT about which model of physics or biology we should use when we're talking about economics is flashing before my eyes.
And we should say in a less esoteric register, Philip Morawski's book More Heat Than Light is devastating when it comes to the history of from the physiocrats to the classical economics to Marx as a classical economist or transitional figure to the neoclassicals and the Marginalist Revolution, all the way to whenever he wrote that book. His argument is that economists are always using outdated physics models, right? They take them from the generation before, the ones that have become intelligible. So they're never on the cusp, and they're always using the outdated physics model. So I'm not the only one.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because in Marxist circles, in the esoteric Varn Patreon, which I normally don't plug on the actual open show because I'm not a total whore, we actually had a long discussion about Philip Morawski. The first person I ever interviewed on my own show when I did my first breakaway from Doug Lane in 2014 was Philip Morawski. And the reason why is I read David Harvey's book on neoliberalism, and I read Philip Morawski's book of neoliberalism, and I threw David Harvey's book out. I'm not a David Harvey hater, actually. I just really don't like that book, because between weird instances of geography in places that don't seem like they belong, and a nearly conspiratorial view of neoliberalism as solely political project and not this whole other broader thing.
Which is weird, because he talks about the broader thing in other works, but
but not in that book. That's why I said I don't hate all David Harvey books, but his neoliberalism book, I could tell he wrote it for a popular audience and was kind of being condescending. But but when I read Philip Morawski's book, and then I read More Heat Than Light, and I have to admit, it did throw all the science analogies made by economists, no matter what the economists, even the economists on my side, I started looking at them a little bit more scant eye than I did before, because the economy is not a metabolic system. No, it's oh my God, equilibrium. Have you ever really thought about what equilibrium would take in economics? It requires, I say this all the time, but it's literally true. If you took equilibrium modeling seriously. To reach equilibrium, you must abolish time.
Well, yeah, because there's no time in
Right. There's no like,
yeah.
there's no that you would have instant total equal knowledge, and I'm like, well, you can't even build towards that. Nor I was thinking about he's a dirty Keynesian, but and not the good heterodox time, but Joseph Heath's argument about even approaching assuming that approaching equilibrium was possible is still, there's no reason to assume it would be optimal. I don't know. But I do find that it is important in some degree to look at aesthetics in their relationship to this, because there is a sense in which I do think that the state of the world, i.e. the general kind of psychology that the economic and social environment is producing, lends only certain kinds of aesthetic things to be popular. And you have a very hard time explaining like why the movies of the 50s to the movies of the 70s to the movies of the 80s seem radically different in a bunch of key ways. And then once 80s hit, it feels like it's just reign supreme until COVID happened, and we don't know what's going to happen after that. So,
yeah, I mean, that was like a deep mystery for me when I started paying attention to, oh, wow, like all these films are, they are all about visual effects, but they're just so obsessed with physics. And like, I'm a student of the history of cinema, Hollywood and global, and it's like, this doesn't happen anywhere else in the history of cinema. I mean, to be fair, there's a tradition of spectacular melodrama that emerges in 19th century stage, and it's very much a part of early serialized spectacles, like series like The Perils of Pauline and The Hazards of Helen, in like the early teens and 20s, and kind of like action spectacular with whiz-bang special effects. Like there's a deep tradition of that, but those don't have, and even like they're hanging off cliff edges and rescues and explosions, but they're not organized in this obsessively physically immersive way. And that was like a light went off for me when I kind of realized that there was something so different about this neoliberal blockbuster cinema, and trying to kind of figure that out.
So for those of you who are interested in the Philip Murawski discussion, the original, now I'm just going to respond to a thing that was asked because it's relevant to what we're talking about. The original interview with Philip Murawski is available for free on Mixcloud. It's from like 2012 or 2013. And my recording equipment was an iPod in Mexico. So you can find it. I haven't put it on any feed. Scott, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some other scholars. I like to spread the good news around. One of the things that the mission of the show is to expose people to different elements of culture, education, political economy, and history from a left perspective. But as I've said, who the hell knows what left perspective even means anymore? So I actually really I'm allergic to debate broism fundamentally. If I'm always like, if I need to debate someone, we should just fight them, like in the parking lot, like
secret fight.
Yeah,
secret fight club.
Everything is secret fight, and maybe with the debate bros, we should just it should be unsecret fight. But I do believe in dialogue, because I've learned the most important things that I've learned, even from my particular views about Marxism, have come from realizing the limitations in dialoguing with people in other fields. And so when they come on, I do like them to share what they think is good in fields that they don't think that my audience would be exposed to. So I'm gonna, this will be our closing question. We're gonna end on some love here, instead of, I'm normally known as the doomer peel guy, so we're gonna be less doomery today and talk about things that you think are good and should be shared to the world.
Oh my goodness. I wish you would have prepared me for this question. I'm answering what should people read that is good in other fields?
Or just in your field, just that they might not see from me.
Oh man. Oh, this is, you've really put
This
me
was
on the
not
spot.
the one I thought was going to be the gotcha question. I thought the one on Heidegger.
Yeah,
was
right?
the gotcha question. You were prepared for that one.
Yeah, this is totally the gotcha question. It's like too much. I don't even know where to begin.
Okay.
Oh gosh.
So let's ask, what work on aesthetics have you found joy in the last, say, 2 months?
Work in aesthetics that I found joy in the last 2 months. Okay. Yeah, so this feels really idiosyncratic, but I'll try. So I just reread, I don't know if your audience is going to be interested in it, but I just reread this work by a media and television scholar named Lynn Spiegel.
Okay.
And she writes a lot about like mid-century TV and mid-century modernism. And she's got a complicated way of approaching these things in ways that are like, you know, both critical, but also interestingly affirmative. I just reread this article about the what was called the storage wall in mid-century modern design, and she starts this essay. It's so weird that I'm recapitulating this. She starts this essay by starting with this kind of move in computing and interaction design that really takes over in the 90s and the 2000s. That's called like ubiquitous computing. And their whole thing was about moving away from the personal computer. Mm-hmm. So the first you had the mainframe, then you had the personal computer. And they were like, no, we need to physically embed computers into everyday life. And this is like the origins of like the smart fridge and the smart everything, right? And everything is, so your computing is no longer you're sitting in front of an interface. It's computation and devices are built into your environment, right? And I would say that we're like both living that world and also not, because we still have massive server farms. We still have, personal computers. And so what Lynn Spiegel does is she says, this ubiquitous computing rhetoric has a backstory, and it's like a clever historical backstory. And she goes to like these architects, or this one particular architect whose name escapes me at the moment, who's really influential, who was very much involved in like designing and theorizing the modern home. And the modern home was going to, the problem with the modern, like suburban, read white middle-class home was that there was like too much clutter, too material commodities, post-war prosperity, et cetera, and the mid-century modern aesthetic was about sleekness and cleanliness, and about like finding ways of storing and organizing and pushing out, like getting out of the way and out of view clutter in a way that pushed back against a certain kind of maternal home environment, and especially like Victorian ornateness and Victorian ornament. You following?
Yeah, I'm totally following you.
Okay, so the storage wall was, we still have them. It's like a wall unit that has cubbies in it, and then very often colored or wood sliding doors that would come in, cover stuff. And she's like interested in this and says this is sort of like the origins of ubiquitous computing. And in fact, these storage walls would not only be a storage retrieval system, kind of like contemporary computers, but also a way of housing media. Like you put your hi-fi in the storage wall and your whatever, your radio and whatever else you had. And she's reading this as a critical feminist and saying, like, on the one hand, this is like interesting. On the other hand, this is like a way of like repressing and putting the maternal labor of the housewife out of sight, right? So she's, and this is in the wake of the evacuation of colored help from the white middle class family. So this creates sort of more labor for mom, and then evacuates and hides that labor under this clean kind of masculine aesthetic. And she's like wrestling with these tensions. And I think it's a really interesting argument. But one of the reasons I think it's so interesting is because I'm a scholar of Star Wars, and I'm really fascinated by the aesthetics of the Empire and the weird like erotic ambivalence that we have towards these aesthetics, which more recently I've been thinking about in relationship to Johnny Ive. He's the Apple designer circa like 2000 to the present, where if you like look at Apple products, they all look like they belong on like an imperial, like on the Death Star or something. Like literally the computer that I'm on right now, looks like it should be on the Death Star.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated about like, I'm not going to be able to flesh this out at all, but I'm like fascinated about like, it's this weird mix of like mid-century military industrial complex meets Nazi fascist aesthetics meets sleek mid-century modern aesthetics. And now that I have this kind of like maternal home story, it's helping me to think about how, like, what other unconscious desires are being expressed that basically, like, when you're inside an imperial space in Star Wars, they're just filled with these like cool looking media walls, right? Little like sleek walls with media baked into them and little lights and switches and stuff like that. So
it's all industrial on the outside, but it looks like an iPod on the inside.
Exactly. And then there's all these weird interrelationships where like Johnny Ive has become a consultant on Hollywood films, and he consulted, like he designed Eve in WALL-E to look like an iPod for Pixar. Mm-hmm. And Pixar, of course, was owned by Steve Jobs for 10 years before that. I mean, there's so many connections. There's so many interesting things. So that's like the most recent thing that I've read that, I don't know, I find meaningful for myself. I don't know if other people are going to find meaningful.
I actually, I was about to say, I thought this was actually quite interesting, and I just looked Lynn Spiegel up, and now I'm probably going to look up that article and try to find it legally somewhere where I have
definitely do that. Yeah.
Academic-esque access somehow. Totally not through Russia. I'd like to thank you, Scott, for coming on. You were my only live show this week, and I know that if the chat feels a little bit like, what? I've taken a policy of ignoring the chat in the actual show, not just here, because the times where I've gotten so mad at the show itself that I've actually cut streams off have to do with chat debates. So I don't really look except to make sure that you guys aren't stabbing each other with some kind of electronic knife or something through the internet, or that I'm not swarmed by sex bots. So, so if you guys felt particularly ignored, I only paid attention a couple of times. Scott, where can they find your work and anything else you want to plug? Obviously, we talked about your book, but what else are you doing?
You can find me on Twitter at Videotroph. It's via video and then TROPH. You can find the Money on the Left podcast at Monthly Review Online, and on our website, moneyontheleft.org. We have a Money on the Left editorial collective that houses several podcasts. including one called Superstructure, another one called Medium Femme, and then we do all kinds of like weird hybrids of all of these all the time. Yeah, I think that's where you can mostly find me.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on. I listen to Money on the Left, and so I think I listen to all the podcasts, but I just get the master feed that throws them all at me. So I'm often like, "Hey Max, were you on this show?" And then he's like, "No." So that happens a fair amount. So are you guys still working with Monthly Review at all, or is that?
Yeah. We put the main Money on the Left monthly interview show on Monthly Review. We seem to have a good relationship. We keep our more critical work vis-a-vis Marxism off of Monthly Review, just to try to be polite. And
I wouldn't call it a fight at all. I mean, like, I actually, you'll get a kick out of this, Scott. I actually was talking about listening to you guys on a podcast I recorded over a year and a half ago that we're going to release probably this month. On Modal Science, about Money on the Left, and I was like, yeah, there's this weird MMT podcast on Monthly Review. They're not Marxist at all. I don't know how it happened. So
yeah, I don't know how it happened either. I think Nathan Tankes is one reason why it happened. But no, I mean, we have a good relationship with them, and they appreciate what we do. And I think, I don't know. I think it works out. Yeah.
We had our theories about why it may have happened, but I'm gonna leave it alone.
Okay.
You can listen to the show when it comes out.
Yes.
But also know that was my opinion from a year and a half ago. I don't think I talked much shit though. I think actually I believe this was leading up to the debate between Max Siho and I. Which I guess now is almost 2 years ago.
That's nuts.
Wow. That's insane. Yeah. Anyway, have a good night, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. I had a really, really nice time.
Me too. All right. We're going to end with the chill close.